Well, hey, y'all. Welcome back to the Oak Grove podcast, this summer edition of the podcast. I'm Joseph, one of your pastors and hosts. Today, we are talking about all things Oak Grove neighborhood. And our special guest today is my neighbor and friend, a fellow walking person in the neighborhood, David Sullivan.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this.
Yeah, and many of you might know him as the man in the yellow hat. Not quite the Curious George version, but David walks almost every morning, and several miles, right? How many?
6 miles.
6 miles. So if you're out in the mornings, anywhere around the church neighborhood, you will see him.
Yep.
Now, before we get into all the things about your walking and that part of it, the podcast this summer is all about the Oak Grove neighborhood. When you say Oak Grove, if you're a part of the church or community, do you mean the church building? Do you mean the neighborhood? Do you mean both? I find myself meaning the neighborhood and the church and everything in it. And so I want us to talk more over the summer as we learn about the neighborhood and the context of this church, but also the rich history and some of our neighbors and how it helps us to be better neighbors to one another as we seek to love God and our neighbor. The vision of Oak Grove United Methodist Church is to build inclusive, life-changing communities and experience transformation in Jesus Christ. We do this by connecting with each other, growing in faith, and living out our faith in the world. And so, a couple months ago, David, I was walking around and saw you as I was taking the trash out or dropping my kid off. And I said, hey, would you want to be on the church podcast about the Oak Grove neighborhood? And you were like, sure, sounds good.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Well, we'll start off with the question sort of about, we ask every one of our guests is, who are you and how did you sort of end up here? So tell us a little bit about yourself, David.
Well, I'm a homegrown Atlantan. I was born here, born in Emory Hospital, by the way.
Wow. Okay.
Grew up, went through the DeKalb County school system. I like to tell people, I don't like it, but I tell people that I probably closed 3 schools. I went to W.D. Thompson Elementary, which is an LA Fitness across from Toco Hills now.
That's hilarious.
Then I went to the original Kingsbridge Elementary, which is now, I think it's a charter type school now.
Yep.
And then I went to Briarcliff High School, which is no building. It's just a field of dreams now.
A field of dreams.
So I've closed down. The people in the school system probably don't want to see me coming. So
that's hilarious. My mother was a teacher for 35 years and retired the same year I graduated.
Yeah.
So we joked that she finally finished high school. Well, that's fun. That's fun. Now, in your career and your work around here, you went away for a bit and came back. But tell us some about sort of your history in the neighborhood.
Well, I went on to Georgia Tech and studying architecture. I firmly believe that they have a course called calculus that they use primarily to weed out the not so smart people. And they tried their hardest to get rid of me, and they almost did. But I wound up leaving school, going into the Navy, spent a couple of years, came back, and got married. My head was on straighter and finished up school. And then we bought a house over down the street from Shamrock High School.
Yeah.
We knew that was a temporary thing, and we found a leftover lot over on Starfire Drive.
Okay.
My parents lived right around the corner on Cadillac, so we were familiar with the neighborhood. We bought that. We were going to pay it off in 5 years and build our house. I told Ruth, my wife, that before we had kids, there were 2 things I wanted to do. I wanted to design and build my own house.
Yeah.
And I wanted to take a trip to Europe so I could see some of this architecture that I'd been studying for 5 or 6 years. And we managed to do that. And then we started, we had a couple of kids, and we lived there for 35 years, raised them both. Both kids went to Lakeside. Both of them wound up going to Emory. And 5 or 6 years ago, I had retired. We wanted to downsize. And we started looking for places to move. We looked at several of the senior communities. We looked at one at Lake Lanier. We looked at one at Lake Oconee. And then my son and his wife had their first child. And we said, okay, that's it. We're not going anywhere.
Yeah, we're staying put.
So we started looking more closely. And we found a little 1-story house on a flat lot that I could add something to. And it's a half mile from where we lived the previous 35 years. So it'll be 5 years in July. We've lived there.
Yeah.
Right behind Oak Grove Elementary. And it's just a great little pocket neighborhood that we love the people there and love being there.
Yeah. Well, it's really fun to hear that you were wanting to to look to move, and they decided to stay.
Yeah.
One thing I've shared often on the podcast is a lot of the folks who are joining our church and becoming members and moving into the neighborhood, it's the same numbers and types of people, are people sort of my age and stage who are having two double income families who are looking to have kids or already having kids. And then it's the other set of people are the grandparents who are moving nearby, either downsizing, but more importantly, to be near those grandkids.
Yeah.
So it's fun that you mentioned both of those things sort of in the same breath.
Well, we've been both too.
Yeah.
When we moved into our house that we built, we were the young couple about to have kids and raise them in the neighborhood. And by the time we left, we were the grandparents, and there were other young couples moving in. So it's a pretty vibrant process that keeps things going.
I don't remember the exact first time we met, but we met when all of us were taking walks during the pandemic. And our family at the time, we just had our one daughter, Allie.
Right.
It's before we adopted our second child. And we were pushing her around and doing things, and ran into you a lot.
Yeah.
And ran into Ruth a lot. And then we realized that y'all were the same household.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we have all these fun stories and interactions of just getting to know one another.
Yeah.
Now, the yellow hat thing, I know you had a story about that. So share that with us a little bit.
Well, when I started walking after I retired, I started out maybe 2 or 3 miles a day, just purposely built that up. And in doing that, I had to walk farther away from the house and come back. And I wore my Georgia Tech hat. I know there's always a ton of UGA people around. I thought I would carry the flag for Tech, and just that became my walking hat.
Sure.
And it was like my sneakers. I'd put my sneakers on and grab my Tech hat and go walking.
Yeah.
And I told you about this before. Part of my route is walking around the back of Oak Grove Church. And I was cutting through there one morning, and this gray Honda van stopped, and window came down, and this lady looked at me and said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure. I'm a friendly guy. You can ask me whatever you want to." She said, "Who are you?"
That's awesome.
And that caught me a little off guard. She said, "We see you everywhere. Nobody knows who you are. You're almost an icon in our neighborhood. We see you. We spot you on La Vista Road, on Fair Oaks, on Briar Lake, and nobody knows who you are or where you're coming from." And I introduced myself and explained what I was. I walk 6 miles every morning. And I see her occasionally all the time now. So it's just an interesting story. She said, "We just call you the Tech guy." And I said, "Well, I've been called worse than that. So that's fine." So.
Well, it's funny because now when I'm riding with our 4-year-old in the car or in the van taking one of our daughters to school, I'm like, "Oh, there's Mr. David." And she usually yells out the window if she can, "Hi, Mr. David."
I've heard that.
And Allie enjoys seeing you too. So it's just funny that there's this sort of almost like you're a local meme. We've spotted the iconic man in the yellow hat.
Well, I'm on my second hat, by the way.
Okay. Now, it's also yellow.
Wore the first one, yeah.
Okay.
The first one wore out. So.
Have to have a retirement ceremony like a flag. Well, that's pretty remarkable. In some of my doctoral work and studies about communities and how communities form and how they have a sense of belonging, there's a thing called asset-based community development, ABCD. And part of what we did in our vision process for the church to look at the vision I just read for the next 5 years of the church was to look at what does the church membership want to do, but also asking our neighbors, businesses, local people we knew, neighbors, what do you see the function and purpose of the church is? A lot of that came down to the mission, things like the Etheridge Inclusive Playground being a wonderful spot for people to engage and be neighborly and enjoy life together. The park that the church has is a great space, green space that's just available for people. And one of the things inside of that ABCD mantra is this thing that we look at as called boundary leaders. And they're people who are sort of these natural connectors of webs, right? Many folks in the community that have someone, you can think of someone who knows a lot of people. Yeah. Not they know everybody, but if they don't mind introducing themselves. A boundary leader is a specific type of person who can be themselves, whether they are at a fundraiser dinner doing something in suit and tie, or they're in their local garden shop picking up stuff, or they're walking the streets, getting to know people. Yeah. It's one of those unique sort of patterns of people who are themselves wherever they are, but also help draw people into that web to feel more connected. And that sense of belonging and being recognized and seen and valued is really important for any community. Now, I think you are one of those people, and you seem to know lots of people around. And even as you and I started talking some about this podcast, it's like, oh, right, I forgot you grew up here and went there. All these sort of natural connections that you have, not accumulating them as some sort of checklist of people or things, but that you are aware of how these things help other people, not just you. And when we talked about this early on, you said, I went home and I made a list of all the people I'd met walking.
Yeah.
But tell us some about how that walking, you shared how it became a thing for you after retirement to stay busy and stay healthy. But then how has that become more than just the actual physical effort of walking?
Well, I think, and it's funny, I did mention that list. I was thinking one day, I said, well, I've met a lot of people that I otherwise would not have known if I weren't walking a ways away from my immediate neighborhood. And I just got out some sticky notes and started writing names down that I remember. Now, I'm horrible with names, but the ones I could remember, I wrote down.
Sure.
It was one thing I really liked about being in the service was everybody's name was right there on your
right on your lapel.
So you didn't have to remember names. But I came up with a list of 38, 39, 40 names of people that I had met between here and walking around my 6-mile route that were not people on my immediate street that I already knew.
Sure.
People that the rule for me was it was somebody I would not have known if I hadn't been walking like I do.
Wow.
And that's now up to about 45 people. So
it's even grown since the weeks.
I look at that as having expanded my neighborhood. It's I have a wider net of people that I know. And the interesting thing with the yellow tech hat, I met about 6 or 7 Georgia Tech people that I didn't know.
You're building the network.
Yeah, they were kind of attracted to the yellow GT. And, oh, I went to Tech, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's a number of people, and I think it's people I still know. And if you're out there and I'm going to walk past you, I'm going to say good morning. So, like it or not, you're going to get a greeting from me. So,
well, and we do that similar thing at church when we have greeters and folks welcoming people, because one of the, I may have shared this with you, the places where you're welcomed by name. In the old days, you come into Sears and they say, welcome in, sir. How can I assist you today? And that's not exactly how things go now in most department stores, if we have them. So one of the things we joke about at church is a place where you should be welcomed. You're welcomed at 3 places now. You're welcomed at church, hopefully, Walmart, greeters, and then at Moe's.
Yeah,
Welcome to Moe's.
Yep.
So we're there often because we have small children. But one of the things you want in that sense of a neighborhood is that welcoming sense, especially as demographics for neighborhoods shift and become more diverse, like ours has over the years, and people of different races and backgrounds, languages, religious backgrounds, and also just different sort of age and stage strata as the neighborhood sort of rolls back over. As you said, you started off as the young couple, recently married, wanting to have kids.
We've evolved.
And you've moved into the grandparent stage. And that's a plan a lot of us have, to stick around and be a part of something for the long haul. The neighborhood of Oak Grove really sort of expanded and exploded in the post-war era, really around 1958, 59, 60, when most of our brick ranches, if we're still in one of those, was built in the neighborhood.
Yep.
And then since then, there have been several other sort of iterations of building. The Oak Grove United Methodist Church also expanded and sort of grew from having 3 services in our sanctuary that is now a gymnasium, the Heritage Hall, 3 services a Sunday with the aisles packed, which the fire marshal now would not go for. And the church in 1966 had a moment wherein in their wanting to build a sanctuary, which is our existing sanctuary, they had folks come forward and lay their mortgages as collateral on the altar for $1 million+ bank loan to build the current sanctuary. So that's some of that generosity that we live out of. These are, again, those would have been relatively new homeowners in the 60s. I can't imagine taking my mortgage and say, I'll back the church's loan.
Yeah.
That is a different level of generosity.
That's a commitment.
And when you think about how it impacts the neighborhood and helps the neighborhood, and it has, then I think that is certainly one of those things. We live off of some of that generosity of those folks from the 60s. And still moving forward, we continue to benefit from sort of that similar ethos, I think. Well, David, I know you're involved in a lot of things here in the neighborhood, but one thing I wanted to ask specifically about is that you're on the board at Kingsbridge. So tell us some about that.
Kingsbridge it's a retirement community, we call it, up behind Briarcliff Baptist Church at Claremont and Briarcliff and Claremont Road. I was asked by the director about 7 years ago if I would be interested in serving on the board of trustees. He was a friend of mine I'd gone to high school with. We both were members at Briarcliff Baptist. And he knew I was retired. He also knew I had a stake in retirement planning because the last 5 years of my career as an architect, I worked primarily on renovating retirement communities like that.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The big thing was inserting a memory care wing into an existing facility because that was becoming something people really needed.
Sure.
So I brought that to the board and just architectural background as well from a facility standpoint. The trustees at Kingsbridge, we're not really a fully hands-on board like a lot of boards, like the school board, for instance. We sort of look over the shoulder of the executive director, and we let him run his staff. We don't try to run things from him. But if he needs some input or advice or that sort of thing, we do that. I was told we'd meet once a month. We got a free lunch, and I said, that's all you need to say. I'm in.
Free lunch.
It does give them some oversight. And it's a nonprofit, and it's run as a community. It's I've been impressed with the level of staff that is there now, and they're caring for the residents.
Yeah.
As a board member, I have asked, and I get emailed to me their monthly newsletter, but they do share birthday wishes. There'll be a note from 2 or 3 residents every week said, thank you for all the cards. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So it's really a home, and we look at it that way. And the staff over there treats it not as a facility, but as a people's home. We've had a good bit of construction going on over there.
Okay.
We actually did shoehorn in a 13-bed memory care unit on the 3rd floor. That started 4 years ago, and since then we've been upgrading other parts of the building. We added a bistro, which has been a real hit.
It's been a big hit with our members.
The residents now have 2 venues for getting something to eat, and it's a good place for family or friends to meet them, get a cup of coffee or something simple to eat there, and not have to go full bore meal to sit down and eat with them. It's long been a pretty top-notch retirement facility.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And again, I knew you had been on the board and done some of that, but it's neat to hear those connections. We have a lot of Oak Grove church members who ride the bus every week for worship services or senior adult events. Some of them are probably listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube because I know they do. Yeah. So hello from Kingsbridge. What's neat about that for me with your work there is understanding how it's not just about caring for people in that one sense of providing just basic care, but it's trying to meet their other needs that they have. The chaplains who are there are great. You have all these different spaces, even having a second sort of dining option that's more of a cafe style. We've heard from our members they love that.
Good.
And that it's somewhere they can just have coffee. When we do visits there, I love the rooms and the spaces. And having that memory care unit that can also be available to them if that becomes the need they have while they're already at Kingsbridge. Yeah. And keeping people in those similar spaces that are familiar and have some of the same rhythms and staff people, especially when you're in that memory phase of life, can be really, really helpful for them.
Absolutely.
Much less for the families who have people going there and for communities who, once you've established yourself, instead of moving far, far away, you can downsize and move to a smaller home. Or at Kingsbridge, you can move into a different unit that might provide more care that you might need. Yeah.
And you mentioned it, but I'm neglecting to mention, but we do have an on-staff chaplain who ministers to the residents as they need it, whether it's hospital visits or meeting with the family, talking about a higher level of care, that sort of thing. So we provide that, and they can tap into that as they need it.
Yeah, and our clergy and staff are often visiting there, our lay people who visit folks, and we help out with some of the high holy day services as which is nice. Well, David, it's really neat to hear about how you're connected, not just to the neighborhood, but also to Kingsbridge, and especially having that knowledge and expertise about sort of architecturally retrofitting things into buildings and spaces, but also that understanding and care for people as they age of what they might need. So I love hearing that about your work at Kingsbridge. Thanks.
Yeah, glad to let you know about it.
Yeah. As we move towards the conclusion of the podcast side of things, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is sort of how do you see sort of knowing more people in the neighborhood and being more involved in the neighborhood, showing up to some of our mission events and things we do, as well as connecting with me on the internet now, not just on the podcast, but on Instagram and other places. How do you see that sort of connecting with your neighbors as beneficial for you and for the neighborhood in general?
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about, I'm not a member of your church, but it's a part of my life because I'm around it all the time. And like you say, I've come help pack lunches and stuff. Yeah. And my grandkids have used your new playground.
We're at the playground together a lot.
And you won't name anything after me, but I've sent you a little money to help pay for that. And
that's very kind.
I feel like that's a part of the neighborhood. And it's really a great outreach part of this church that is really a part of the neighborhood. It's not just a building that people show up on Sunday and maybe one day during the week, but it's a living, breathing, especially with the school and the daycare and, like I said, the playground. The Boy Scout troop that is connected here. There's just so many connections to the community that it's positioned well too. If you were to look at the Oak Grove community as the overall community, not the church community, but it's positioned right in the middle of what I consider it. You look at Oak Grove Road as the spine, and you maybe go off half a mile in either direction, and it goes from Briarcliff Road to La Vista. You're smack in the middle. You're perfectly located. So God was looking at you when he said, buy this piece of property.
Buy this piece of property. Well, I think that's remarkable. And what's interesting is one of our guests later on, I hope, for the podcast, a family gave the land to the church, the Kirkland Akeland family. And so they gave the land to the church, I think maybe for $1, and the land for the parsonage as well. And so this church exists, again, out of that generosity of the neighborhood and community. And the thing I tell people when they ask me about the playground at the church, and there'll be people playing during Sunday worship, and I'm great with that because sometimes as a parent, what you need, or a grandparent, is you need that moment of relaxation and calm and peace that might happen more on the playground than it might sometimes in a building when you're trying to wrangle kids. But I love what you said about how this is still your church in many ways. Yeah. My friends who are Muslim or Baha'i or Sikh or are non-theological, not religious, who I meet on the playground and we work in the neighborhood together, the community gardens, other places, they joke about this being their church too. Yeah. And I love that because that's what churches ought to be, is their community. And the community is so good to this church. And so we're glad.
I think that relationship is what determines whether that's my church or not necessarily my name being on a roll somewhere.
Right. Yeah, in the old ways of church membership and things, you had to become a Christian or behave like a Christian, become a Christian, and of course behave had certain moral standards, and then you belonged. Yeah. Well, the way churches like Oak Grove do things now is you belong. Yeah. And this is a part of how this church sees itself as a part of the neighborhood, not just for the church's sake, but for all the people, all the kids, that the rising tide lifts all the boats. Yeah. And I think that's...
Well, you look at the New Testament and how they reached out to the community they were in. They weren't in a certain building, and it was open to everyone. And so you're following that path.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad to have you as a part of our neighborhood sort of coalition of walkers and people working for the good of our neighborhood and for all the people, but then also for your work in helping Kingsbridge and helping a lot of our church members who are there. I think that's really hugely important for people as they get older, as they want to stick around the area, and as they, have that sense of connection and belonging. What are some of your hopes for the neighborhood going forward over the next, couple of decades or years?
Well, I'm not one that likes change just for the sake of change. So my initial reaction to that is I'd like it to stay the way it is. But having said that, it's not, I mean, it's a stable neighborhood. It's a great group of people, a good variety of ages and types of people. But we're not, I say it's stable, but I just, again, out of curiosity, I took a look at the loop, the North Aiken, South Aiken loop that I live on,
Yeah.
and look back, I could look at the houses, and over the past 5 years where Ruth and I have lived in the neighborhood, there's been 10 houses that have been moved in and out of. So there's 10 new people there in 5 years.
Wow.
Where if you don't think about it, you think it's a really stable neighborhood. Well, it is, but it says people want to be here.
Sure.
And I hope if nothing else, I hope we're still a community that people want to be a part of. And I think if we continue the way we interact with each other now, I think we will be.
Yeah. Well, I like that a lot. And again, being a neighborhood that people belong to, and regardless of you find yourself in the Oak Grove neighborhood or some other neighborhood, wherever you might be listening to this, I think we all want to feel that sense of belonging, a sense of connection, a sense of safety, of knowing your neighbors. It really does help everybody everywhere to do that. So wherever you might find yourself, you can work on that this week. Your challenge might be to get out and have a walk, a stroll, a roll, whatever you might do. And take it from Mr. David. There's someone you don't know, but like, hey, how are you? Good morning. Good afternoon.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's in the morning during the summer because it's really hot out there. But that's a really good way to think about it.
I'll be there.
Yeah. If you see Mr. David, please do wave and say, hey, Mr. David, we saw you on the podcast. Well, David, thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's been
a fun time chatting with you.
Yeah. Well, we'll do it some more out in the streets, the playground, and maybe back here on the podcast later on. Well, friends, thanks y'all for watching and being a part of the podcast, listening to it. Share this with a friend or a neighbor if they might know Mr. David or might know about the neighborhood things happening. They might get more involved in the church or in the neighborhood things that help all of us have better lives for belonging and ways to connect with each other and with God. Well, thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next episode. Peace, y'all.